Okay, we're going to move on to Joe Kiniry, excuse me. Joe comes to us from Galois Incorporated out of Oregon. He is the tech project manager for a very important project that we are working on that we launched publicly last year at Summit. And that's the end-to-end verifiable internet voting project. Nobody will be quizzed on the name, which I shortened for you, actually. I'll summarize it overall. It takes a research approach to the controversial question of internet voting. It's a project that brings together a diverse group of people, scientists with election officials, the most important bodies, and it also attempts to tackle many of the other important questions that range from usability to security. I'd like to thank our sponsor for that project. That's the Democracy Fund, and in particular, Adam Ambrogi, who's in the audience today, for his particular care and concern and leadership on the project. Now, Joe is going to come up here, and he will not be talking specifically about that project. He's actually going to talk about the promises of technology to increase the transparency and trustworthiness of elections, which is a base foundational element of the project. We're going to hand over to Joe now. Oh, there you are. I thought you were that thing. Great. Do you want the podium? Or?
I'll take the podium.
Okay.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everybody. Excellent. We're smiling and awake this morning. I may be a little wonky because I just flew in from Los Angeles this morning. Forgive me. My name's Joe Kiniry. I am a principal investigator at a company called Galois. It's not the cigarettes. It's named after the French mathematician. We're in Portland, Oregon. A couple of my colleagues are here with me today. We're a strange company. We do research and development on high-assurance secure systems. We focus on systems that cannot fail, or something goes horribly wrong, or you lose a lot of money, or someone dies. We think elections are critical systems, and that's why we're interested in this topic. I'm a reformed academic. I was a professor in Europe for over 12 years at 4 universities, and one of my research areas is elections. Now, my premise for my work is that technology causes change. If we reflect upon the sorts of evolution we've seen, especially in the last decade, it's quite remarkable that in my pocket I have this really powerful computer that my 2-year-old daughter can use. I find that remarkable. And moreover, living in Europe, her grandparents have watched her grow up basically over Skype and FaceTime. Social media connects us all. We use Facebook, and even though I do so to share information with my family, I also feel horrible because I'm also leaking all kinds of information to corporations and governments. And elections are being modernized all over the world by computing technology, and yet, because of that modernization, elections are no longer simple and inexpensive and transparent things. These technologies that we introduce force trade-offs. Now, I'm a computer scientist, so you're probably going to think I'm going to stand up here and say, use more computers, when in fact, most of us say the exact opposite. It's better to rely upon more traditional mechanisms that we understand really well. I'm all for paper-based elections. But when we force technology into the equation, whether it comes from the scientists or the politicians, you're always exhibiting trade-offs. Which would you rather have? Would you rather have privacy or security? You're often asked. Can we really build a truly secure system like we might build for, say, the Department of Defense or intelligence agencies, which is what I do in my spare time? But can you do that so that my grandmother can use it? Can we increase engagement with, say, voters by targeting young voters through the use of technology and not lose my mother, who doesn't really enjoy using a computer and often calls me and asks me to give tech support, even though I'm a PhD? And when you build these sorts of systems, you often have to make trade-offs because you can't have it all. You know, faster, better, cheaper, pick 2. Or In the world of internet voting, for example, which virtually every person in my field rejects out of hand because it's incredibly difficult and we don't really know how to solve it today, but we think it's an interesting problem, you often find that the system can either be secure or it can be usable. We're trying to figure out still today how it can be both. So these new capabilities that scientists come up with often provide mechanisms for new engagement in the area of elections. For example, increases in voter registration and more accurate voter rolls are fundamentally outreach mechanisms that can be done through social media and database problems, if you squint at them right. Increased voter turnout and shorter lines can be facilitated by technology that increases transparency at the polling place. Accessible and independent voting systems for the disabled are all about technology, since, for example, most folks who are sight impaired don't read Braille. Finally, trust in election results, if we can engender trust through technology in some intelligent ways, not just by slapping computers that are expensive everywhere, perhaps that will lead to fewer disputes, lawsuits, and what I call election shenanigans. That's the kind of thing where I look at the results of an election as a scientist, as a security person, and as a mathematician, and I find funny business that I can't explain, and yet we all just have to shrug, given our current election apparatus. The impact of this technology is broad. It's not just going to impact voters when we make a decision about how we change elections or how we use computers. It can impact everything from the voters to the super PACs. Everything from political parties to media. And so we have to be careful about the introduction of new technology and not just ram it down the throats of the American public. So I'm going to introduce to you now a few new capabilities that are engendered by modern computing technology. Most of them, some of them you'll have heard of before, some of them are completely new, and some of them are the kinds of things where you say, I don't understand how that's possible. And your mind goes, pow. I like that part. That's usually engendered through the use of mathematics and cryptography and these sorts of fancy things, but there's always trade-offs in these decisions. So all I want to do now is plant some seeds in your head about what is possible and have you reflect on whether or not the adoption of that technology is wise. Right? Just because we can do it, should we do it? For example, one of the easy ones, election day efficiency. When I was a professor in Denmark recently, one of the things we discovered quite rapidly was that elections in Denmark were very bursty, and we had polling places that had big long lines, much like here in America, despite all the planning of the election officials. So we built a little inexpensive, off-the-shelf, open-source, open hardware system. You could drop it in any polling place, and magically, you would know how long the lines were there, and you could broadcast it via SMS, mobile, on a website. No deployment cost, no training, easy peasy. You just drop it in there. Of course, what's it doing? It's doing that by watching people's cell phones as they walk into the polling place, figuring out how long it took you to get to the front of the line, how long it took you to leave. So in the adoption of this cheap, easy technology that's going to make polling place behaviors accurate, we can reflect on them later, and you can know how long the polls are at any point in time, we've now traded off that cost and efficiency of the election for the privacy of voters. Because if you build the system wrong, which invariably they will, you will leak information about who's at that polling place when, how long they were there, and maybe from that information you can derive other information about how they voted. So here's the trade-off. Clarity on how long lines are, more efficient elections, but leaking privacy about voters. Is that a legitimate trade-off? Election day reporting. Imagine that we could have real-time reports automatically generated on every piece of election equipment in America. It wouldn't just be shaky YouTube videos of machines misbehaving. You would have an instantaneous report nationally of the behavior of every single machine. If a machine goes offline, everybody knows it. If a machine misbehaves, everyone knows it. And let's imagine this was recommended recommended, as usual, by new federal certification standards. And yet the existing vendors said, I refuse to do this because it will disclose trade secret information. That's the kind of thing they always do, and they always put their hands on their hips like this. So here's the question. Is this an acceptable compromise? Now we're trading off transparency of election day behavior so that we can make the overall election system better and perhaps catch some of those shenanigans versus harming existing business practices, right? We see this collision happening very often here in America with our nice big four companies that take care of all our elections. Next, voter verifiability. At its core, you heard Susan introduce this end-to-end verifiable internet voting project that I'm running as the technical manager. It's an area I've worked in for many years. It involves basically all the top people in the world, from computer scientists and cryptographers to local election officials and usability experts, some of which are in the room today. If you want to hear more about it, there's a workshop tomorrow. But imagine this. Imagine you can vote, maybe in the traditional way you always have, maybe even with paper and pencil, and yet after the election, you get a receipt. You take that receipt home, and with that receipt, you cannot prove how you voted. It doesn't show anything about how you voted. But after the election, you can use that receipt to check that your vote was recorded properly and was actually in the tally. Irrefutably in the tally. Now, the problem with this is a cool idea. It goes back to research in the 80s and 90s, but it's all from crazy cryptographers, these guys who do number theory and encrypt things, and I'm one of them, so I can tease them. This capacity to do this is only enabled by using fancy math. That's the way that you can think of it. Behind the scenes, there's fancy math. It means that the election apparatus is no longer transparent. The only people in the world who will actually understand how the election works are the cryptographers in some sense. So is this an acceptable trade-off? Suddenly we have verifiability of your vote. You can find out, every single person can find out, was my vote recorded properly and tallied properly? And yet nobody understands how it works. Now, one might argue we currently don't understand how it works. And that's compounded by the use of computers in elections, but this is a step further. And I'm often asking myself, is this a legitimate compromise? And if it is, when is it a legitimate compromise? In the context of the project Susan mentioned, it's possibly a legitimate compromise only for overseas voters and the disabled. That's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis we must test. Another idea, risk-limiting audits. Risk-limiting audits, some of you may have heard of. This is the idea that has been created by my friend Phil Stark at Berkeley. It has been trialed in California for several years now. The idea is that after an election, you can audit an election using a different branch of statistics, essentially, that lets you randomly pick a small subset of ballots rather than flipping a coin and picking one precinct and recounting everything there or doing the standard 1% recount. With a risk-limiting audit, you can compute whether or not an election outcome was accurate by counting a very small number of randomly chosen ballots. If you have, for example, a county with 10,000 voters or 10,000 votes, you might only have to recount 100 ballots using a risk-limiting audit. So it's extremely efficient, and it gives you whatever threshold of correctness you want. I want to be sure my outcome was correct to 99.999% accuracy. Well, if you set that bar high, then you may be counting a few more ballots, but you're certainly not counting, say, 1% of all your ballots. Now, here's the trade-off that you're making, though. You're increasing election accuracy and trustworthiness, but to perform that audit, you're delaying the reporting of the outcome. Say it's 2 hours later than it was before. Now, of course, when we watch the news on Election Day, we all know the outcome is not reported actually by the precincts. It's reported by the media. But in this case, the question is it okay to slow everything down for 2 hours, despite the fact that the politicians want to know right away and the media wants to know right away what the outcome is, if it increases that accuracy? That's the trade-off that we're making there. And then finally, campaign finance. We discussed this morning. Congressman gave a good talk. I was really I was excited about that. Imagine that the campaign finances for every candidate in every election, not just at the federal level, but all the way down to the local level, was available in real time on your phone. You could actually watch the numbers grow, kind of like that federal debt indicator somewhere, or the number of people living in America. Imagine that this was mandated by federal law. I know I'm an optimist. And actually affected through the Federal Elections Commission. And yet to do so, of course, there's going to be a reporting infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And you're going to have to maintain that infrastructure over time. So it's going to cost money to track the money. So the trade-off here is, if you were to have this ideal world where we have transparency in campaign finance, is it acceptable to pay that upfront money to get the system in place and then to pay the overhead to keep it running if we have long-term transparency in our finances? That's the trade-off you're making there. Now, every single one of these capabilities I've mentioned exists today. We can build it. We actually know how to do it scientifically. So even though we can't predict how elections will look in 20 years, we can at least have hopes and dreams about how it could be. But we have to realize that those hopes and dreams all boil down to, often, the introduction of technology and compromises therein. So I want to ask you, if you think about these properties that are possible with today's technology, is that an acceptable compromise? Should elections be more accessible, efficient, transparent, trustworthy, perhaps even verifiable? But to get there, what are you willing to give up? Because you don't get everything for free. There's always compromises therein. If you want to know more about this kind of stuff, come to the workshop tomorrow. Talk to myself or my colleagues that are here about these topics. And if you want to know more about what we do and how it's a little fun when it comes to elections and high assurance systems, I suggest you watch 60 Minutes on Sunday at 6 o'clock. You might be a little frightened by what you see. Thanks very much.